We're talking about unfair dismissal. Unfair dismissal is part of the Fair Work Act. It's found in 3-2 of the Fair Work Act. It's got its own section and it's quite large. Now, what is unfair dismissal? Unfair dismissal is when you have been terminated from your job and you think that there's some sort of unjust, unfair or unreasonable element to it. Now, dismissal is a bit of a complex question because it falls into the eligibility requirements. But if you were, for instance, a contractor and your job came to an end and it wasn't renewed, then it's more than likely that you haven't been dismissed. It's more than likely that your contract came to an end and it hasn't been renewed. But if you are a permanent employee, a part-time or full-time employee, or if you're a long-term casual and your employment has been terminated and in such a way that you feel that there's some sort of unjust, unfair or unreasonable element to it, then you might be entitled to filing an unfair dismissal application through the Fair Work Commission. Now, working towards unfair dismissal, I'm just going to turn to the Fair Work Act. Now, the Fair Work Act says that a dismissal is unfair if the Fair Work Commission is satisfied that you've been dismissed and the dismissal was harsh, unreasonable or unjust, and the dismissal is not consistent with the Small Business Fair Dismissal Code, and it's not a case of genuine redundancy. So there's a lot of criteria there that needs to be satisfied before an unfair dismissal is put in place. For most people, general redundancy, small business code doesn't really affect you, it affects the employer, but it's certainly something you should consider because both of those are threshold questions. If indeed the employer has satisfied the Small Business Fair Dismissal Code requirements, then it cannot be considered an unfair dismissal, and that is also found in 3-2 of the Fair Work Act. So let's go to dismissed. Meaning of dismissed is a person's been dismissed if the person's employment with his or her employer has been terminated on the employer's initiative, or if the person has resigned, if you resign from your employment because you feel you are forced to do so through the conduct or course of conduct engaged by your employer. Now what that means is if you feel like you've had to resign, and this is often called constructive dismissal, but just be aware that constructive dismissal actually isn't defined in the Act. We call it forced dismissal or forced termination, or your forced resignation. So although it is okay to use the term constructive dismissal, it's probably better for you to use the correct terms if you actually are filing in the unfair dismissal regime. Okay, so a person has not been dismissed if you're employed under a contract of employment for a specific time and that contract's come to an end, or you were training or under a training arrangement, or you're employed for a specified time or a specified reason. Look, there's a whole pile of criteria there. It also talks about if a person's been demoted, but that's a super complicated area, and we would certainly encourage you to seek proper legal assistance if you've been demoted and feel like that's actually dismissal in disguise. Now the other criteria is whether it's harsh, unjust or unreasonable. Now that's also found in the Fair Work Act and it falls under 387 of the Act. Now there's a pile of criteria for determining harshness. You don't have to satisfy every single criteria, but there needs to be something in there that will encourage the Fair Work Commission to fall in your favour. So the first one is whether you've been given a valid reason for the dismissal, and whether that dismissal is related to your capacity or conduct. The second one is whether the person was notified, whether you've been notified of that reason. So let's just go back to those two, because they are probably the biggest ones that we get complaints about. The first one is whether there was a valid reason for your dismissal, and then whether you were notified of that reason, and then whether you're given an opportunity to respond. So that kind of all falls into the first three categories. Now this can happen when your employer says, hey, I noticed that you were swearing the other day. We don't allow swearing in the workplace. You know that, it's part of our policy. Please watch your language. is there any reason why that was happening? So it could be as simple as that, or it could be something more formal. We've performed an investigation and we've noticed that you've been using the computers inappropriately. You've been looking at online content that's prohibited here in this business, and we're going to be having a further investigation about that. But we would also like to get your response as to why you were looking at that content, or whether you have an excuse and you feel it wasn't you at all. And your employer's given you a chance to respond to that. So that's actually probably the biggest part of the criteria when it comes to harshness. The next part is whether your employer's unreasonably refused you a support person. Now that doesn't mean that your employer must provide you a support person. They don't have to say, look, we're going to have a meeting tomorrow. If you would like to bring a support person, you may. They don't actually have to say that. But if you say, this meeting tomorrow, I would like a support person, and your employer says, no, you're not allowed one, and that meeting's about your continuing employment with the business, then that could be an unreasonable refusal. Other unreasonable refusals could be you refusing to allow your lawyer or legal representative to appear, or not giving you enough time to get the right representative for your support person. I'm not going to go into the role of a support person, but that's obviously important as well. The next part of the criteria is if your dismissal was related to unsatisfactory performance, whether you were warned about that performance and had a chance to improve. Yeah, and there's some other criteria about the degree and size of the business, whether they've got a designated HR team, people and culture team, and what other criteria the Fair Work considers relevant. Now that's a catch-all, obviously. So when we're thinking about the harshness, we're mostly thinking about whether you were told about this, whether you're given an opportunity to respond, and whether they considered that response. We have heard cases where there's been an employee that's been put into a meeting for a response to a show cause or some sort of disciplinary action, and at the same time you can see on the table they've got a termination letter. Well, obviously anything that person has to say probably wasn't considered before that termination letter was drafted, because it was drafted before the meeting. So there is a good chance that on the balance of probabilities that part of the criteria may have failed. That doesn't mean it's an unfair dismissal, it just means that criteria hasn't been satisfied. Now, do you need a lawyer? For an unfair dismissal, you actually don't need a lawyer. If you've qualified, and we'll talk a little bit about the criteria for unfair dismissal applications and qualifying for that, but if you qualify to file an unfair dismissal, you don't need a solicitor to help you. You don't need a legal representative or a non-legal representative to help you. The forms can just be filled in and filed appropriately, and then the process just runs through. Now let's talk a bit about qualification. There are a few big ticket items when it comes to qualification. If the business you work for is a small business, if they have less than 15 employees, so 14 or less employees, then you must be employed for at least a year before you're entitled to make an unfair dismissal application. If the business has 15 or more employees, then that drops down to 6 months, and that's when your eligibility kicks in. Now, if you're a casual employee, you need to be a long-term casual, and you need to satisfy a certain criteria for that. You need to have filed within 21 days of the dismissal. Now that is a fairly strict criteria, and there is some cases out there where it's been filed, the most recent one, where it's been filed 2 minutes late and the Commission decided that it wasn't going to get over the line. So please don't file your applications late. You must pay the filing fee. If you don't pay the filing fee, your application may fail as well. But there are ways to get around the filing fee by filing an additional form talking about financial hardship. You also need to earn under the high income threshold, and at the moment, as of May, June 2020, the high income threshold is 148,700. I think I've covered all the criteria. However, the Fair Work Commission bring out a bench book called the Unfair Dismissal Bench Book, and that is a very large document. It's in PDF form, but we certainly encourage you to take a look at that, because that'll give you all the criteria for whether you're eligible to file. It'll give you the criteria and information about harshness and unjust, and whether you've been terminated. It'll also talk a little bit about the next process, which is the conciliation, which takes 90 minutes, and it will give you a little bit more information about what happens next as well. So when it comes to unfair dismissal, consider the criteria for harshness, consider whether you're eligible for unfair dismissal, think about what's actually happened to your employment and why you're filing, and then make sure you file within the appropriate timeframes and pay that fee. So unfair dismissals can be complicated, as you can see, or they can be done on your own. But if you're feeling like you need some help, or it's a bit too stressful, or you just want some more information about this, you can always give us a call. We can certainly help you. We can also help you prepare and file the application, and we can also help in that conciliation stage as well. There are possibilities that we can get better results for you, or we can just take a lot of that stress off you and get you to sleep that night. Okay, well, thank you for watching, everyone.